Welcome to Deepucator Stories. In a neighborhood where the rules were law, one woman was judge, jury, and executioner. Her name was Carolyn Reed, an HOA president who believed her power was absolute. She thought she could threaten a new black resident into submission over the color of his planters. But she made one fatal miscalculation. The man she targeted wasn't just a quiet neighbor. He was an undercover FBI agent, and her petty tyranny was about to accidentally blow the cover on a multi-million-dollar criminal investigation. Join me as we unravel the story of a woman who picked the wrong fight and the agent who used her arrogance to catch a ghost. The Queen of Serenity Pointe. The community hall at Serenity Pointe smelled of lemon-scented cleaner and stale coffee, beige walls, fluorescent lights that hummed a low, constant note. It was a room designed for compliance, a perfect reflection of the neighborhood it served. On the small stage, behind a folding table, sat Genevieve Blackwood. Her blonde hair was a perfect, unmoving helmet. Her pearl necklace sat just so. She was the president of the Homeowners Association, the HOA. But everyone in the room knew her true title, the Queen. Her eyes scanned the silent figures in the folding chairs, neighbors who avoided each other's gaze. They were not here for community. They were here for judgment. And tonight, the judgment was for the man in the back row, Elias Vance. He had lived in Serenity Pointe for 3 months. To the residents, he was an anomaly, a quiet black man in a neighborhood of loud whispers. He rented the house on the corner, the one with the old oak tree. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees. He did not look nervous. He looked patient. This unnerved Genevieve more than any argument ever could. She tapped the microphone. The sound was sharp, a crack in the oppressive silence. "The meeting will now come to order," she said. Her voice was smooth, but with an edge of cold steel. "We have one item on tonight's agenda. Number 12, Willow Lane, the residence of Mr. Elias Vance." A projector screen behind her flickered to life. An unflattering, close-up picture of a lawn appeared. "Violation 1," Genevieve announced, her voice echoing slightly. "The lawn." She paused, letting the word hang in the air. "Grass height measured at 3.5 inches. The community guideline is 2 inches. Precisely." Another picture. A recycling bin at the curb. Violation 2. The bin was not retrieved until 9 p.m. on Tuesday. Rule 47B clearly states all receptacles must be removed from public view by 6 p.m. The slideshow continued, ending on a grainy image of a small security camera next to his front door. And finally, the most serious offense. Genevieve's voice dropped, becoming grave. "Conspiratorial. An unauthorized surveillance device installed without HOA approval, a violation of privacy, a threat to the very security of this community." She clicked off the projector. The room plunged back into the dull, humming light. "These are not just rules. Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her gaze sweeping over her silent subjects. "They are the very fabric that holds us together. They protect our property values. They protect our way of life." She looked directly at Elias. "Mr. Vance has shown a clear disregard for this fabric. For us, therefore, the board proposes the maximum fine and a formal request to his landlord for eviction." The fine, a word that made the air in the room feel heavy. Eviction, a final threat that kept everyone in their chairs, silent and obedient. Genevieve straightened a stack of papers. "We will now proceed to a vote." A faint, triumphant smile touched her lips. This was the end of it. The anomaly would be removed. Order would be restored. But then, something unexpected happened. Elias Vance stood up. He did not stand up quickly. He rose slowly, deliberately, A tall man. His movements were calm, fluid. The silence in the room deepened, pulling tight. Every eye was on him. He walked to the front, stopping a few feet from the stage. He looked at Genevieve. His expression was unreadable. "My name is Elias Vance," he said. His voice was quiet, but it filled the room, deeper than anyone had expected. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather case. He flipped it open. "Senior Special Agent Elias Vance," he continued, holding up the golden badge inside. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI." A collective gasp swept through the room. A soft, shuffling sound as people shifted in their seats. Genevieve's perfect smile froze, then shattered. Her face went pale, the color draining away, leaving a mask of pure disbelief. "And I am not here because of the lawn," Elias said, his voice turning cold. "Precise. I am here investigating a multi-state money laundering operation." His gaze shifted slightly to the man sitting in the front row, a well-dressed man who had been silently supporting his wife, her husband, Arthur Blackwood. "An operation," Elias continued, his eyes locked on Arthur, "that uses shell companies to wash its money. Companies disguised as legitimate businesses. Companies, for example, like Serenity Landscaping Services, the very company this HOA has been paying $40,000 a month to." Arthur's face turned the color of ash. "It was a brilliant scheme," Elias said, his voice laced with a cold irony. "Hidden in plain sight, in the one place where no one would ever question outrageous fees. The HOA." He looked back at Genevieve. Her mouth was slightly open. The Queen had been dethroned. "Your obsession with my lawn? Mrs. Blackwood, your constant surveillance of my trash bins, your complaint about my security camera." He paused. "You led me right to him." As if on cue, two people stood up from the audience, a man and a woman, dressed just like the other residents. They were not neighbors. They were agents. They moved towards Arthur Blackwood with quiet, professional purpose. The click of handcuffs was the only sound in the silent room. Genevieve made a small baby-s, choking sound in her throat. She stared at her husband, then at Elias. Her perfect, beige world had just been dismantled, piece by piece, right in front of her. The meeting was over, but this was not the beginning of the story. It was the end. To understand how a kingdom built on perfect lawns and beige paint could crumble so completely, we must go back. Ampere's crack in the porcelain. 3 months earlier, the moving truck pulled away from the curb at number 12. Willow Lane. Its diesel engine a harsh intrusion into the afternoon quiet. Elias Vance, now living under the name Marcus Thorne, stood in the echoing silence of the empty living room. The house smelled of fresh paint, a specific, neutral shade of beige that seemed to be the official color of Serenity Pointe. Everything, from the walls to the trim to the very air itself, felt muted, controlled. His cover was carefully constructed. A freelance writer seeking quiet refuge from the city, a man with no loud hobbies, no frequent visitors, no complicated past. His possessions, unpacked with methodical care, reflected this narrative. A sturdy oak desk, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with classics and contemporary fiction, a comfortable armchair, nothing too expensive, nothing too cheap. He was creating a character, a man who would blend seamlessly into the beige background, a man quiet enough to be ignored. The streets outside were pristine, almost unnaturally so. Lawns were manicured with a precision that suggested fear rather than pride. Not a single dandelion dared to sprout. It was a manufactured peace, an enforced serenity that felt heavier than any city noise. Elias could feel the constant, low-level hum of observation. This was not a community that relaxed together. It was a collection of individuals performing the act of peaceful living. In the mailbox, nestled between advertisements for lawn care services, was a thick, cream-colored welcome packet. It was heavy in his hand. Inside, a 50-page booklet, bound in a glossy cover, detailed the Serenity Pointe community covenants, conditions, and restrictions. And on top, a personal letter. The paper was expensive. With Genevieve Blackwood's name elegantly embossed in gold script at the top, the letter was a masterpiece of polite intimidation. It welcomed him with paragraphs of warm, flowing prose. It spoke of shared values, of a collective commitment to maintaining excellence. It was filled with aspirational words like harmony, cooperation, and community pride. But woven between the lines of cheerful greeting was an unmistakable warning, a reminder that his every action, from the color of his curtains to the placement of his garden hose, was subject to review. Compliance was not optional. It was the price of admission to this suburban paradise. A few days later, the first test arrived. It came not as a letter, but as a silent, Digitalprobe, an email. The subject line read simply a friendly reminder. The message, signed by Genevieve, was brief and surgically precise. It noted that a cardboard box from an online retailer had been sitting on his front porch for a duration exceeding 4 hours. It politely directed his attention to Rule 19C of the Covenants, which stated that all packages must be brought inside in a timely manner. The stated reason to maintain curb appeal and prevent potential theft. Elias stared at the screen. 4 hours. Someone had been watching his porch. Someone had noted the delivery time and had waited, stopwatch in hand, for the violation to occur. This was not a friendly reminder. This was a demonstration of power, the first subtle crack in the perfect porcelain facade of Serenity Pointe. He pictured a neighbor peering through their blinds, taking a note, making a call. He deleted the email without replying. A response would signal engagement. Silence, he knew, was often more unsettling. His real work began after the sun went down, after the last porch light had been switched off according to schedule, while Serenity Pointe slept its perfect, regulated sleep. Elias was wide awake. He sat in his darkened study, the only light coming from the glow of his encrypted laptop, casting long shadows on the beige walls. His target lived just a few houses down, in a larger home with a 3-car garage. Arthur Blackwood. From his second-story window, Elias had a clear, discreet line of sight. He watched the Blackwood residence, not as a neighbor, but as a predator. He noted the late-night visitors, the expensive, dark-windowed sedans with out-of-state plates that would glide silently to the curb after midnight and depart before dawn. He logged license plates, ran them through secure databases, and began to build a silent, invisible web of connections. Across the street, in the house directly opposite his own, a light was often on in an upstairs study window. An old man, thin, with a shock of white hair and sharp eyes behind thick glasses. Elias had learned his name from the ornately lettered mailbox. Alistair Finch, a retired history professor from a prestigious university. He seemed to spend most of his evenings reading, a solitary figure in the window's warm glow. But Elias, a lifelong student of human behavior, noticed something else. Professor Finch was not just reading, he was observing, watching the quiet, perfect street with an analytical interest that went beyond simple neighborly curiosity. He saw the same cars Elias saw. He noted the same odd hours. Elias clicked delete on another email from the HOA. This one concerned the precise 45-degree angle at which his trash receptacle should be placed at the curb. He sighed, a quiet breath in the silent house. He had come to this place to hunt a shark, a predator hiding in these placid, shallow waters. He hadn't expected to be circled by a tireless, vigilant piranha, guarding the surface. The Gospel of Beige. The constant stream of emails was a low-grade annoyance, a hum of static in the background of his mission. The direct confrontation, however, was a formal declaration of war. It happened on a Saturday morning. The sun was warm, the air still and sweet, with the scent of freshly cut grass cut to exactly 2 inches. Of course, Elias was on his knees in the small, board-approved patch of dirt that served as a garden. He was planting lavender, small, defiant bursts of purple against the oppressive, endless beige. It was a small act of personal rebellion, a quiet claim to a single patch of ground. He sensed her presence before he saw or heard her, a shadow falling over him, blocking the morning sun. He looked up. Genevieve Blackwood stood on the pristine sidewalk, a leather-bound clipboard held in one hand. She wore a crisp white pantsuit that seemed to repel dirt by its very existence. She was smiling, a bright, fixed expression that did not reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne," she said. Her voice was as bright and hard as polished porcelain, designed to sound friendly but carry no warmth. "Mrs. Blackwood," Elias replied, keeping his own voice even. Neutral, he remained on his knees. A deliberate choice. It put him in a position of supplication, which he knew she craved. But it also allowed him to continue his work, signaling that she did not have his full attention. "I see you're adding a personal touch to the landscape," she said, gesturing vaguely at the small purple flowers with a gold-plated pen. "How lovely." Elias waited. He knew this was not a social call. This was an inspection. "It's just that," she continued, tapping the pen against her clipboard. A sharp, rhythmic sound, according to the approved planting palette for this quadrant of Serenity Pointe. "We strongly encourage colors in the white, cream, or pale yellow spectrum. It's a matter of cohesion. Cohesion." The word sounded clinical, lifeless. It was the Gospel of Beige. "I see," Elias said. He did not move. He did not offer to pull the flowers out. He did not apologize. This lack of immediate compliance seemed to frustrate her. Her smile tightened at the edges. "We have certain standards here, Mr. Thorne. It is what keeps our community so harmonious. So desirable. We wouldn't want any disruptive elements to spoil the view. Would we?" The words were so carefully chosen, so perfectly polished. Disruptive elements. It was not about the color of flowers. It was never about the flowers. Elias had heard this language his entire life. In different towns. From different people. It was a polite, sanitized code for people who looked like him. Living in places like this, his training, his discipline, years of conditioning, screamed at him to remain passive, to de-escalate. His cover was everything, but the man inside, the man who had grown up with these veiled insults, felt a familiar, hot knot tighten in his stomach. He wanted to stand up, to look this woman in the eye and challenge her. He stayed on his knees. He looked from the small, vibrant purple flower to her cold, pale blue eyes. "I just thought a little color might brighten things up," he said, his voice quiet, almost gentle. "But I certainly appreciate you taking the time to bring the community guidelines to my attention." He had given her nothing. No anger to fuel her righteousness. No submission to satisfy her authority. Just a calm, impenetrable, polite wall. It was the one thing she did not know how to handle. Her face flushed a faint, angry pink. She was a queen whose subject had refused to bow, even while kneeling. "Well," she said, her voice sharp with irritation. "Just see that it's handled." She turned on her heel and walked away, her back rigid with indignation. As she retreated, Elias glanced across the street. In the large bay window of the house opposite, he saw the silhouette of Alistair Finch. The old professor was standing there, a book held loosely in one hand. He had been watching the entire exchange. When their eyes met across the manicured lawns, Alistair gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it was not one of judgment. It was one of understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the performance he had just witnessed. Alias knew, in that moment, that he was not entirely alone in his observation of the Queen's reign. He looked back at the small lavender plant, a tiny spot of defiance in a world that demanded conformity. Genevieve was so focused on a single, harmless flower. He thought, she had no idea her whole perfect garden was riddled with poisonous, deep-rooted weeds. That single, silent nod between two masters of deception wasn't just a look. It was a message, a signal that passed across the manicured lawns, unseen by the Queen. If you felt the power of that unspoken connection, comment, signal below. Now, Elias must decide if that signal was an invitation or the opening move of a far more dangerous game. Stay with us to find out. This is Depu Cater Stories, where silence always speaks the loudest. Whispers in the walls. The confrontation over the lavender was, unexpectedly, a gift. Elias realized that Genevieve's escalating obsession with him was the perfect cover. She had made him her personal project. The rogue element that needed to be brought into line, while she was busy documenting the exact length of his grass and the timing of his trash disposal, no one was paying any attention to her. Or, more importantly, to her husband. He decided to lean into it. He let her watch. He let her send her sharply worded emails about the precise angle of his newspaper on the driveway. He let her take photos from her car of the new, unapproved bird feeder he hung from the old oak tree. Each petty complaint she filed with the HOA board was a beautiful distraction, a cloud of procedural smoke that allowed him to move through the neighborhood's digital corridors completely unseen. His focus shifted entirely to the HOA's finances. Every resident had access to the online portal, a supposed gesture of transparency that was, in reality, rarely used by anyone. For Elias, it was a treasure trove of unguarded information. He spent his nights digging through years of digital budgets, scanned expense reports, and poorly formatted meeting minutes. It was a desert of beige numbers and mind-numbingly boring procedural language. It was designed to be opaque, to discourage scrutiny through sheer tedium, but Elias was trained to find patterns in chaos, to hear the whispers hidden in the walls of data. And then, after 3 nights of meticulous work, he found it. It was a single, recurring line item, Serenity Landscaping Services. The payments were enormous, far exceeding any reasonable cost for the neighborhood's upkeep. They were also consistent, $40,000 every single month. Like clockwork, he cross-referenced the payment history with the HOA's own records. The cost for landscaping had tripled, almost to the dollar. Approximately 1 year ago, that date coincided with the appointment of a new treasurer to the HOA board. The new treasurer was Arthur Blackwood. The next afternoon, Elias was outside, methodically pulling up the lavender plants. He replaced them with white petunias. Approved. Compliant. An act of surrender in his public war. To fuel his progress in the secret one, he saw Alistair Finch across the street, tending to his prize-winning roses. The old professor had a gentle, precise way of moving, his hands knowledgeable and sure. After a few minutes, Alistair crossed the street, holding his copper watering can, its surface gleaming in the sun. Those look much more harmonious, Alistair said, a slight, knowing twinkle in his eye. Elias allowed himself a real smile, just trying to keep the peace. Professor, it seems more important than gardening. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. The only sound, the gentle stream of water from the can, as Alistair gave the new petunias a drink. Things have certainly changed here, Alistair said quietly, his voice tinged with nostalgia, as if speaking to himself. This used to be a nice place, friendly. People talked to each other over their fences. Now, they just measure them. Elias decided to take a calculated chance. He needed a voice from the inside. A piece of history the documents couldn't provide. I was looking at the community expenses online, he said, keeping his tone casual. Curious. The landscaping fees seem quite high for a neighborhood this size. Alistair stopped watering. He stood up straight and frowned, his brow furrowed in thought. They do, don't they? Funny thing is, I've never seen a truck with that name on it. Serenity Landscaping. Not once. He looked at Elias, his gaze sharp and intelligent. And I see everything on this street. The old company, Green Pastures, did a fine job for a third of the price. Good local boys. But their contract was terminated right after Arthur joined the board. That was it. The final piece, the human confirmation for the digital breadcrumbs. That night, back in his study, Elias used his secure agency resources. It took less than 10 minutes. Serenity Landscaping Services was a shell corporation, registered to an address that turned out to be a mail drop box in another state. It had no employees, no equipment, no physical address. It was nothing but a name on a piece of paper. A ghost company incorporated by a known financial associate of Arthur Blackwood. The money was not for landscaping. It was being laundered, siphoned from the residents' own fees and washed clean, right under the noses of the entire community. Elias leaned back in his chair, the web now complete and visible only to him. Genevieve thought she was tightening a net of petty rules around him. She had no idea she had been methodically brations and calmer, passionately, helping him tie the final knot in a noose for her own husband. All he needed now was one final, decisive pull. The final street raw. The final pull on the noose came not from Elias's patient investigation, but from a place of pure, unadulterated arrogance. Genevieve Blackwood, increasingly frustrated by Elias's infuriating calm and his complete refusal to be intimidated, decided that the existing violations were not enough. They were mere infractions, procedural annoyances. To achieve her goal, his swift and public removal, she needed to prove that he was not just a nuisance. She needed to prove he was a danger. She convened a secret, emergency meeting with two of her most loyal board members in the sterile perfection of her living room. The air was thick with conspiracy and the scent of potpourri. He is not just a writer, she declared, her voice a low, urgent whisper, as if the very walls might be listening. No writer is that composed, that watchful. He is hiding something. I believe he poses a threat to the security of our families, to the very sanctity of Serenity Pointe. One of the board members, a man named Gary, who worked in corporate information technology, mentioned, almost as an aside, that the community hall's public Wi-Fi network logged all user activity. It was a standard security measure, he explained, to prevent illicit use of their shared resources. An idea, cold and sharp and thrilling, formed in Genevieve's mind. It was a flagrant breach of privacy. It was almost certainly illegal. She did not care. The rules, she had long ago decided, were for protecting people like her from people like Elias. They were not meant to restrain her own righteous quest for order. She was the shepherd of this flock. And sometimes, a shepherd had to venture into murky territory to protect her sheep. She persuaded Gary, with a mixture of flattery and fear-mongering, to pull the network logs, specifically, the logs connected to the device Elias used when he occasionally worked at the hall for a change of scenery, an act she had always found suspicious in itself. The report, a simple printout of data, came back a day later, Genevieve read it in the hushed quiet of her personal study, her heart pounding with a sense of righteous, vindicating victory. The logs showed that Elias's laptop had accessed several heavily encrypted financial databases, international corporate registration sites, and obscure shipping manifests. To her, this was the smoking gun. He was a fraudster, a corporate spy, or worse, she had caught him red-handed, using their community as a base for his criminal enterprise. The irony was completely lost on her. She moved with the swift, decisive energy of a predator closing in. The final letter was drafted on her thick, cream-colored stationery, the kind reserved for the most serious of communications. It was not a warning. It was a summons, an indictment. Elias found it in his mailbox that afternoon, tucked between a gardening catalog and a utility bill. The envelope felt heavy. Final, inside. The letter was a masterpiece of righteous fury, every word dripping with condemnation. It accused him, in the strongest possible terms, of using community resources for suspicious and potentially illicit digital activities. It declared him a clear and present danger to the peace and security of Serenity Pointe. It concluded by calling for an immediate and mandatory community-wide meeting, the sole item on the agenda, a binding vote to compel his landlord to terminate his lease, to evict him. He read the letter twice, standing in the quiet of his beige living room. A slow, cold, utterly satisfied smile spread across his face. It was more perfect than anything he could have planned. She had overplayed her hand so spectacularly, so completely, that she had just handed him the entire game on a silver platter. She thought she was building a cage for him, using the bars of community bylaws. In reality, she had just meticulously locked herself inside one. He picked up his secure satellite phone, a device that never touched any local networks, and made a single call to his field supervisor in Washington, D.C. "She took the bait?" he said, his voice calm, devoid of any triumph. It was the simple, professional statement of a fact. Hook, line, and sinker. The meeting is Thursday night. At the community hall, he paused, listening to the response. Yes, that's correct. She's making it public. I need the arrest warrant for Arthur Blackwood finalized and ready. And I want a full audio and video recording of the entire meeting. 2 agents undercover in the audience. Every word spoken in that room needs to be on the official record. He ended the call and stood by the window, looking out at the perfectly manicured street, at the houses that looked identical in their enforced perfection. The trap was set, the bait had been taken, and the hunter was now just waiting patiently for the prey to walk into it, convinced she was the one in control. That Thursday evening, as he got dressed, he did not choose a writer's casual attire of jeans and a sweater. He put on a simple, well-tailored dark suit, a crisp white shirt, a conservative tie. He was not dressing for a neighborhood meeting. He was dressing for an operation. Genevieve, he knew, thought she was preparing for a trial, a public execution of his residency, a final reassertion of her absolute authority. Elias knew he was preparing for an arrest, a quiet, professional takedown of a criminal enterprise. The stage was set, the lights were on, and the Queen, in all her righteous glory, had absolutely no idea that she was not the director of the evening's drama. She was merely the main character in a tragedy of her own making. The aftermath. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs was a sound that broke the spell. It was brutally final, and punctuation mark on the end of the Blackwood's reign. For a moment, the only sound in the beige, fluorescent-lit room was the quiet professionalism of the 2 undercover agents securing Arthur Blackwood. They were efficient, their movements practiced, and sure, a stark contrast to the performative drama of the HOA meeting. Then, shouts erupted, not in a wave of shouting or screaming, but in a flood of frantic, shocked whispers. 100 quiet conversations ignited at once, spreading through the folding chairs like a brush fire. The residents of Serenity Pointe turned to each other, their faces a gallery of shock, confusion, and a dawning, horrified understanding, the foundation of their perfect, orderly world. The world built on rules and regulations and the absolute authority of the Blackwoods had just crumbled into dust beneath their feet. Elias stood near the stage, a calm, unmoving island in the swirling sea of collective panic. He watched as Arthur, his face ashen and his expensive suit, suddenly looking cheap and ill-fitting, was led towards the door. The man did not resist. He did not speak. He seemed to have shrunk to the aura of power and influence he carried, just moments before now gone, completely evaporated into the stale, conditioned air of the community hall. He was no longer a pillar of the community, he was just a suspect. Genevieve remained on the stage, frozen, a statue carved from pure disbelief. She watched her husband go, her eyes wide and unblinking, tracking his every step until he disappeared through the doors. The color had not returned to her face. She looked from the empty doorway to Elias, her expression not one of anger or hatred, but of a profound and shattering incomprehension. The world no longer made sense. The rules had been broken, but not by the man she had accused. They had been broken by her own life, her own husband, in her own perfect home. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply shut down. The queen had been checkmated, and her mind, unable to process the new reality, had abdicated the throne. The neighbors who had been her staunchest supporters, her court of loyal followers, now avoided her gaze. They became suddenly, intensely fascinated by their own shoes, by the texture of the linoleum floor, by anything other than the spectacle of their fallen leader. Those who had silently resented her iron-fisted rule now whispered more boldly amongst themselves. A current of relief mixed with a new, uncertain fear running through the crowd. Power had shifted in an instant, and no one was sure where it had gone, or who would wield it next. Elias's job was not over. He coordinated quietly with his team via a small earpiece, ensuring the scene was secured, that witnesses were identified, and that no one interfered with the agent's work. He was all business, his focus absolute, his face an unreadable mask of professional detachment. Then, through the shifting clusters of bewildered people, a figure emerged, walking with a slow, steady purpose. Alistair Finch. The old professor navigated the chaos as if it were not there, his eyes fixed on Elias. He stopped directly in front of him. For a moment, the room and its frantic energy seemed to quiet and recede around them. Alistair did not say, "I knew it," or "Thank you." He simply reached out a thin, steady hand, a hand that had likely held thousand-year-old books, and placed it on Elias's shoulder. He leaned in close, his voice a quiet anchor in the storm of whispers. "You did the right thing, son." The simple words, spoken with such quiet conviction by this near stranger, struck Elias more deeply than any official commendation or medal ever could. It was an acknowledgement not just of the agent, but of the man, a recognition of the lonely, frustrating path he had walked for the past 3 months, navigating a world of petty tyranny to uncover a greater evil. Elias gave a short, grateful nod, the only emotional response he allowed himself. He looked around the room, at the stunned faces, at the wreckage of the Blackwoods' perfect life, at the empty stage where the queen once reigned. The arrest was just the result, the visible outcome, but the real story, he knew, was in the invisible threads he had followed to get here. The whispers in the data, the color of the flowers, the quiet, courageous conversation over a garden fence. The story was in how it all came together, a story that only he, and now perhaps the old history professor, truly understood. Unraveling the Threads. A few days later, the scene shifted dramatically. No more beige community halls or perfectly manicured lawns that hid dark secrets. Elias sat in a sterile, impersonal conference room on the 12th floor of a federal building downtown. The air smelled of clean carpets, strong coffee, and the quiet weight of the law. Through the large window, the city spread out below. A sprawling, complex organism indifferent to the tiny dramas of suburban life. Across a polished mahogany table sat Assistant U.S. Attorney Danielle Chen. She was a sharp, composed woman in her 40s. Her dark hair pulled back in a severe but elegant bun. Her intelligent eyes missed nothing. She reviewed the preliminary file in front of her with an unnerving stillness. Her job was to take the tangled threads Elias had gathered and weave them into an unbreakable legal case against a very powerful man. Walk me through it from the beginning. Agent Vance, she said finally, closing the file. Her voice was calm, professional, but carried an undercurrent of genuine curiosity. I have the reports, but I want to hear it from your perspective. Elias leaned forward, his hands resting on the cool, solid surface of the table. He began to speak, his voice a low, steady narrative that filled the quiet room. He explained that the Bureau's white-collar crime division had been tracking Arthur Blackwood's larger criminal enterprise for over a year. They knew he was laundering millions for an offshore syndicate. But all their leads on his domestic operations went cold. He was insulated, protected. They couldn't find the local mechanism he was using to wash the first crucial layer of cash. The weak link. We needed a way inside his personal world. Elias explained, a way to observe him up close, in his own habitat, without raising any alarms. The rental house in Serenity Pointe was the perfect listening post, low profile, quiet, and right under his nose. But you found more than you were looking for, Danielle prompted, her eyes focused intently on his. Elias nodded slowly. I found his wife, Genevieve Blackwood. He paused, choosing his words with the precision of a surgeon. She was the unwitting key to the entire operation. I've run into informants, double agents, and moles in my career. I've never had an asset quite like her. Her obsession with control, with enforcing the HOA's rules down to the last millimeter, created the perfect cover for me. She made me invisible. He detailed the constant stream of emails, the public confrontation over the flowers, the endless list of petty violations. Every time she focused on me, it drew attention away from her husband. She made me the neighborhood villain. While everyone was watching the writer with the slightly too long grass, no one was watching the respected treasurer moving hundreds of thousands of dollars. And her obsession with the rules forced me to study them myself. I had to know the covenant bylaws better than she did, just to protect my cover. That's what ultimately led me to the financial reports. He explained his discovery of the Shell Landscaping Company and the crucial, corroborating piece of information provided by the retired professor, Alistair Finch. That was the first concrete link between the numbers on the screen and the reality on the ground. The history that the documents couldn't provide. Danielle Chen listened intently, making occasional, precise notes on a yellow legal pad. And the final piece, she asked, tapping her pen. The security camera. Her report made it sound like you were spying on the whole neighborhood. A faint, ironic smile touched Elias's lips. The final piece was her own doing. A gift. The simple doorbell camera she cited as a major violation was motion-activated. It recorded every car that came and went from the Blackwood house at all hours of the night, including the car of a known co-conspirator from out of state, on a night he was supposed to be 500 miles away. Herr Formel. Written complaint about that camera is what gave me the legal justification to review its stored footage as part of my investigation. She handed me the physical evidence that corroborated the entire financial trail. He leaned back in his chair. The story laid bare. a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise brought down not by a dramatic raid or a high-speed chase, but by a lonely agent, a curious old man, and the blinding, relentless arrogance of a woman obsessed with the color of flowers. Danielle Chen was silent for a long moment, her fingers steepled in front of her, her expression thoughtful. She looked at the file, then back at Elias. Her next question was quiet, delivered with a different tone, less prosecutor and more human. And what about her? What happens to Mrs. Blackwood? The irony is almost poetic. The woman who policed every visible detail was completely blind to the real crime happening right under her nose. Do you think she deserves punishment? Or pity? If you're ready for the final chapter of her fate, comment fate below. Don't go anywhere, because we're about to find out if the Gospel of Beige leads to a prison cell or a lonely, empty mansion. This is Deepu Cotter Stories, where every character must face the consequences Ampere's different kind of justice. The investigation concluded that Genevieve Blackwood had no direct knowledge of her husband's criminal enterprise. She was not charged. But justice, Elias knew, came in many forms. Arthur Blackwood was facing a federal indictment, a mountain of evidence, and decades in prison. His was a clear, procedural path. Genevieve's sentence was something different, something keener, and perhaps more profound. Her sentence was the silence. It was the neighbors who now crossed the street to avoid her. It was the empty chairs around her at the community pool. It was the sudden stop in conversation when she entered the local grocery store. Her power, built on a foundation of perceived perfection and whispered intimidation, had vanished overnight. She was no longer the queen. She was a pariah, the wife of a criminal, a living monument to a spectacular fall from grace. Her perfect, beige world had become her prison. A few weeks after the arrest, on the day before Elias was scheduled to move out of number 12, Willow Lane, he received a text message from an unknown number. It contained only 5 words: "Meet me at the lake." There was no signature, but he knew who it was from. The lake was at the edge of the development, a small, man-made body of water surrounded by a walking path and a few lonely park benches. It was neutral ground, belonging to everyone and no one. He found her sitting on one of the benches, staring out at the still, gray water. She looked smaller. The helmet of perfect hair was slightly out of place. The crisp white pantsuit had been replaced by a simple gray cardigan. She wore no makeup. And for the first time, Elias could see the fine lines of age and exhaustion around her eyes. She did not look up as he approached and sat on the opposite end of the bench. Leaving a respectful distance between them, they sat in silence for a long time. The only sound, the gentle lapping of water against the shore. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and the promise of rain. Finally, she spoke, her voice raspy. Unfamiliar. It was the voice of someone who had not spoken much lately. Why? It was not an accusation. It was a genuine question, heavy with bewilderment. Elias did not answer immediately. He looked out at the lake, at the perfectly spaced willow trees that lined its banks. He could have answered as an agent, with talk of evidence and indictments, but the question was not for the agent. It was for the man she had tried so hard to expel from her perfect world. You spent your life building a museum, Mrs. Blackwood, he said, his voice soft, thoughtful, a perfect, quiet, beautiful museum where everything was in its proper place. She turned to look at him then, her eyes filled with a raw, painful confusion. You polished the floors, he continued. You straightened the frames. You enforced the rule about not touching the exhibits. You were so focused on making sure no one left a single fingerprint. You didn't notice your own husband was stealing the paintings off the walls. He let the words settle in the quiet space between them. He could see the thought turning over in her mind, the metaphor clicking into place. A community isn't a museum. He said, it's a garden. It's messy. It's unpredictable. Things grow in places you don't expect. Sometimes there are weeds, but it's alive. You were so afraid of a few weeds. You paved over the entire garden with concrete. She did not reply. She just turned back to the water, her posture slumping slightly. A single tear escaped from the corner of her eye and traced a slow path down her cheek. It was not a tear of self-pity, or even of remorse. It was a tear of bitter, devastating understanding, the dawning of a truth she had spent a lifetime avoiding. Elias stood up. There was nothing more to say. Her trial was just beginning, and it would take place not in a courtroom, but in the long, silent hours of her own mind. He knew her sentence would be to live out the rest of her days in the ruins of the museum she had so carefully built, haunted by the ghosts of the paintings she had never known were missing. As he walked away, leaving her alone on the bench, he did not feel triumph. He did not feel pity. He only felt a quiet, profound sense of sorrow for a peace that had never been real. As he drove out of Serenity Pointe for the last time, past the rows of identical, perfect houses, he wondered if a real garden could ever grow here now. The quiet after the storm. 6 months later, the memory of Serenity Pointe had begun to fade, replaced by the urgent, gray reality of Washington, D.C. Elias stood in his office on the 9th floor of the J. Edgar Hoover building, looking out at the endless traffic flowing through the city. His life was a world away from beige walls and lawn violations. It was a world of classified files, encrypted briefings, and the constant, low-grade hum of national security. His assistant placed a small stack of mail on his desk. Bills, department memos, junk mail. But at the bottom was something unusual. A single, hand-addressed envelope. The paper was a heavy, cream-colored stock. The handwriting was elegant. Precise. The script of an academic from a bygone era. The return address was in Serenity Pointe. He slid it open with a letter opener. The letter was from Alistair Finch. Elias sat down in his chair and began to read. The professor's words were as carefully chosen as his gardening. He wrote not of the trial, or of the Blackwoods, but of the neighborhood. He wrote of the quiet, subtle changes that had begun to take root in the months since Elias had left. The HOA had been completely restructured. He wrote, a new board had been elected. A young mother of 3, a retired firefighter, a high school science teacher, ordinary people. The 50-page Book of Covenants had been condensed to a simple 2-page document focused on safety and shared maintenance. The rest had been thrown out. The Gospel of Beige was over. Alistair wrote that he had seen a house on the next street over being painted a cheerful shade of blue, and no one had filed a complaint. He described how the perfectly manicured hedges that had once served as barriers between properties were slowly being trimmed lower, creating lines of sight, creating connections. Last weekend, the letter continued. The community had held its first neighborhood barbecue in over a decade. It wasn't a formal, catered affair in the community hall. It was a spontaneous gathering in the small park by the lake. People brought folding chairs and coolers. Kids who had only ever seen each other on their way to school were now playing together, their laughter echoing across the water. Someone had brought a guitar, and in the small garden at number 12, Willow Lane, the new family that had moved in had planted flowers. Bright, colorful, chaotic flowers, purples and reds and yellows. And next to their mailbox, someone Alistair did not say who had planted a single small lavender bush. The letter ended with a simple, profound paragraph. You came here to find a criminal, Elias. It read, and you did your job well. But you did something more. You held up a mirror, and you forced us to see what we had become. You did not give us new rules. You gave us back our neighborhood. For that, We are all in your debt. Elias folded the letter and placed it carefully on his desk. He looked out the window again, at the sprawling, powerful city below. He had spent his career fighting large, monstrous evils, chasing shadows across continents. But the victory described in that simple letter felt more real, more lasting than any of them. He thought of the lavender, a tiny spot of defiance, a single, small act of courage, and in that quiet moment, high above the noise of the nation's capital, Senior Special Agent Elias Vance understood a fundamental truth. That true serenity, the kind of peace that Serenity Pointe had always claimed to offer, was not found in perfect lawns or beige-colored walls or the rigid enforcement of rules. It was found in the imperfect, sometimes messy, but deeply authentic spaces in between, the spaces where people chose to look at each other, not as potential violations, but simply as neighbors. Ultimately, the story of Carolyn Reed is a powerful reminder. Never underestimate the person standing in front of you. She built her world on the power of small rules, only to have it crumble when met with the quiet strength of true character. It shows that arrogance is blind, but integrity always sees the path forward. I'd be moved to read your thoughts on this in the comments. If stories like these resonate with you, I would be honored if you would consider joining our community at Deepu Cater Stories. Thank you for your time and for being a part of this journey.